Okay, so I think we'll move to Smriti.
Hi, I'm calling in from Chandigarh in India, and I'm a freshman biotech student, really excited about frugal science and its applications in how we can bring the idea of synthetic biology to many people so that then we can also bring the products of synthetic biology without scaring people about the science.
Michael Hutape. And if you could just mention where you're connecting from. Michael.
Hello, my name is Michael Hutape, and I'm an high school student, and I'm interested in frugal science.
Where are you connecting from, Michael?
Oh, I'm from Indonesia, from Denpasar, Bali.
Perfect. Next, Arnav, and I'll give you guys a little bit of a warning. Arnav, Elaine, and Tafia.
Hey there, my name's Arnav. I'm a resident surgeon working in Bangkok, Thailand at a neurological center here. I'm really interested in trauma surgery, global health, and sustainable development of surgical technology for public health growth.
Elaine and Tafia.
Yeah, cool. Hi everyone. My name is Elaine. I'm from Jakarta, Indonesia, and I'm a biodesigner. And I really wanted to learn more about frugal science because one of my research interests is sort of like how do I advocate indigenous and local communities so that we could put them at the seat at the table in terms of like, like the climate change that we're facing and how we can sort of like make responsible design choices and advocating them into the position. So yeah, really nice meeting you all. I'm looking forward to the subject.
Tafia.
Hi all, I am Tafia. I am a biomaterial design researcher and also biodesign enthusiast from Indonesia. I come from architecture background and actually met Manu at the Bali Fab Fest event last year. So yeah, I'm passionate in creating a bio-based innovative solutions and making it accessible for people. And also I'm curious to democratizing access to science for the people in Indonesia. Nice to meet you all.
Next is Arman Sia, and then Arjun and Marwan.
Hello all, my name is Arman Syabdamapang from Bali, Indonesia. And I really interested on electricity and magnetism. And from this session, I would like to know how frugal science applied on a field of electrical engineering.
Next,
hello everyone.
Hello
everyone. I'm Arjun from Tamil Nadu, India. I'm an entrepreneur currently working on bio-based materials using mushrooms and mushroom-based products out of it. And looking forward for a beautiful session. Thank you.
Marwan.
Hello, I connected from Sudan. I am fascinated by developing basic infrastructure for rural area using frugal concepts.
Harshit, Vivek, and then Jeffrey.
Hi, my name is Harshit Patel. I am from India. I am an undergraduate psychology student. I want to work for the betterment of mental health in tribal population in India. There is lots of stigma around mental health in India. People call names, they use words like lunatic and all. So I want to work for the betterment in a population where they don't know that they have problems. Like most of their problems are, they attribute those problems to physical causes. There is a lot of unawareness. I want to improve that. And I'm really glad to be here, excited to learn from all of you. Thank you.
Go ahead, Vivek. Vivek, I think your audio is off. Try again. If you unmute yourself. And Vivek, if the link doesn't work, you can also type your intro in the chat, and then maybe in the very end, I'm going to come back to you. I think sometimes when you connect headphones, it is often the case. Okay, so we'll move to Jeffrey because I want to cover this very quickly and kind of transition into talking a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So Jeffrey, Pius, and then Grace.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Matthias. I'm a high school student who are currently settled in Bali, Indonesia. I have a science overall, but I wanted to pursue in chemical engineering, especially on the chemical design process and also the oleochemical. I wish to combine my knowledge of frugal science and chemical engineering. Thank you.
Okay, next is Pius and then Grace. Pius, can you hear us? Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Grace, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I am Grace. Sorry, I cannot turn on my camera. I am a high school student from Bali, Indonesia, and I am interested in the environmental management with the frugal science. Thank you.
Next is Ratwa and Yona.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Professor. My name is Ratu Patina Sapasaribu. I'm a high school student from Indonesia. I'm interested in this event, Frugal Science, because I have attended one of your event also that about a fault scope, I think last month in Bali. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Next is Niputu.
Hello all, I'm Ananda. I'm actually a high school student who preparing for my undergraduate in computer science, but I'm interested in frugal science because last year I attended fault scope workshop with purpose team, and that's all. Thank you.
And I'm gonna, if I miss some names got shuffled. We're gonna keep going. The next was Jonah Musa. Jonah, can you hear us? Okay, I think we're gonna come back to that. Folks that can't turn the mics on, then you can also type your little intros in the chat itself, and then I'll mention in Discord channel, we usually all introduce ourselves when we start. Next is Sayu and Ribka.
Hello everyone, my name is Sayu. I am streaming from Indonesia. I am a science student and part of the Indonesia Maju Scholarship. Last time our scholarship has given a chance to see the full scope. So that make me interested into being creative in designing solutions for real problems that we are facing. So yeah, that's all.
Okay, I think next we're gonna have Prabhawati, and then Tiffany, and then Tapan.
So hello, my name is Ribka Anastasia Sitorus. I'm a high school student from Bali, Indonesia, and I'm interested in studying frugal science and its application in our lives where everyone can read science. Thank you.
Okay, I think next, Prabha, can you hear us? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So nice and privileged to be here in this year of frugal science. I've done my PhD from IIT Madras in cancer biology and my postdoc in stem cell research and exosome biology. And then I had some experience with industry, and now I'm working as a senior scientist with Center for Cellular and Molecular Platforms, CCAMP, part of Bangalore Life Sciences Cluster, in a program called INDEX, Indigenization of Molecular Diagnostics. It was an emergency program started during COVID, funded by Rockefeller and Atmanirbhar of India. And we are into aiding MSMEs and other startups who are interested in developing molecular diagnostics kits for most of the infectious diseases and as well as non-infectious diseases. So having enjoyed the complexity of biology in various fields like oncology, stem cells, and everywhere, now I feel it's my turn to give it back in a more simpler way to the society. So, to actually contribute with the simpler aspects of science is what I feel would be more fulfilling. So I thought I wanted to be a part of this program.
No,
thank you
you
so
for
much.
connecting. And again, as I mentioned, many of you are playing a role, engaging, even though you have lots of experience. And so people didn't catch this, that this was the center that enabled a lot of COVID tests to be manufactured in India. And there was a big ramp up. And, again, you can imagine the kind of experience that you build in a crisis like that. So thank you so much, Prabha, for connecting. Next is Tapan.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tapan. I'm connecting from Hyderabad, India. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yes. I run a startup based on ocean. I run a startup which does carbon capture and sequestration, ocean-based carbon capture sequestration. I foresee a need to test the waters for the effects of our technology on the ocean. So I've joined this course. Thank you so much.
Yeah, perfect. And this is very timely, Tapan, because ocean is going to be a big portion of the class this year. Next, I can see Ginger, Zajib, and then Sunny.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ginger, and I am currently in Thailand, but I'm from United States, originally from China. I work for a company called Hackster, which is under a electronics distribution global company called Avnet. I originally studied solar and renewable energy, and have been working actually open source hardware in all my professional careers in robotics, and I am very interested in global access of science and engineering technology to all the communities. So I'm very happy to be here and be on this journey with everyone. Thanks, everyone.
And then the next is Jazib and then Sunny.
Hey everyone, I'm in the city of Lahore in Pakistan. A while back, I was an undergrad in electrical engineering at Stanford, and that was just when bioengineering was starting off. And later I've had a chance to study technology and education at Harvard. I've mostly worked in the software entrepreneurship industry, but I have a lot of interest in teaching. I've been teaching at the university level here in Pakistan, and I think this is a great way to connect with my interests around teaching and deep tech.
Thanks for connecting, Jazib. Sunny.
Hey, I am Sunny Kumar. I am a postdoc in chemical engineering. I am connecting from Atlanta. So my work is basically on biophysics of living system, but I'm interested in to fabricate low-cost instrument like electron microscopy, okay. Thank you.
So I think I know I missed a few group of people, but what I'm going to do it for the sake of time, because after the class, if folks can stay, we can have a little more of a deeper discussion. And I think we will use, for the folks who didn't get a chance to introduce themselves, we will do this at the start of the session, maybe max 5 minutes or something. I think there's a couple of group of people here. I'm going to pass that around again so that they could do a quick round of intros. And you get to meet, because we will be running this as a hybrid class. So I'm going to try to move this around. And so the first is Abina.
Hi, everyone. I'm one of the teaching assistants for the class. Do you want me to take the laptop?
No, it's okay. We'll just be pointing.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's in the rough direction. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I'm Abina, one of the teaching assistants. I'm a second year PhD student in the bioengineering program here. And I'm really interested in regenerative engineering and also women's health. So I'm excited to get to know everyone and have a good time in the class.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm also one of the TA in the class. I'm a 6th year PhD student in Vinay's lab, and I'm really interested in ocean sciences and cell behavior. So if anyone's interested in frugal applications in the ocean, then hopefully can help with that.
Hi, I'm Ramya. I'm a 3rd year undergraduate studying computer science, and I'm interested in healthcare and diagnostics and how we can make that more frugal, but broadly interested in meeting everyone in the class and hearing everyone's ideas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly. I'm a 2nd year undergraduate studying bioengineering here.
I also first heard about the concept of frugal science through the Foldscope, like I heard some of you guys say. And I'm really interested in things like biodiversity conservation and also the intersections of environmental and human health.
Hey everyone, I'm Jackson. I'm a Master of Public Policy student at Stanford. I concentrate in health policy, and I'm interested in reducing our nation's and the world's sky-high healthcare costs.
Hi everyone, my name is Meret. I'm a first-year design student here at Stanford. My background is in economics and design research, working in health, construction, financial inclusion across Asia and Africa. I'm interested in maybe assistive devices and how we can use textiles in assistive devices. So excited to work with you all.
Hi everyone, I'm a first-year chemical engineering student here at Stanford. I'm doing a PhD program, and I'm interested in applying fundamental biology and physics to design healthcare solutions.
Okay. Hi, sorry. Hi, I'm Steven. I'm a senior in product design. I don't have any specific kind of fields that I'm interested in, maybe healthcare, but I just know I want to make an impact with the work that I do, so that's why I'm here.
Hi everyone, I'm Baba. I'm a third-year PhD student here at Stanford in the Department of Material Science. My work focuses on using light or spectroscopy to identify and differentiate different types of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And for my interest, I'm really interested in kind of more deeply understanding the process from like an idea in a lab to an actual product on the ground and all the problems that could arise.
Hi, everyone. I'm Varun. I'm a master's student in computer science, and I'm interested in how you design a product with frugality in mind.
Hi, I'm Samir. I'm a fourth year studying CS here. I'm interested in like infrastructure and transportation, as well as maybe how you can use frugal science to like build scalable data sets and that sort of thing.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm also one of the PAs. I'm a PhD student in Manila's lab. My background's in fluids and mechanical engineering, and I'm interested in the ocean stuff and medical devices.
Okay, and I think most of you know me. One of the things we're going to try to do is there is a whole lecture on just introduction of what is frugal science. I'm going to first mirror my screens because I'm realizing I'm looking on two sides at the same time. So just give me 1 second. Displays. Now I know if my hope is that soon enough we'll be able to get past this tech challenges. Okay, anybody knows how I mirror screens? I thought that was okay. Okay, perfect. Now I can actually look at you guys. Sorry about that. Oh, but now suddenly that part is gone. All I did is transfer it. Oh, okay, I was too excited too quickly. Hold on. I think it's worth doing because if I go to displays, people, if they know the answer, can always shout out in the chats. What if I... Oh, one of these, when you drag it. Oh, this just moves. Okay, I think you probably don't want me fiddling around. Oh, mirror for, there we go. Okay, I think that's much better. Yeah, sorry about that. So I think there is a whole lecture just dedicated to the introduction of frugal science. And I think we will talk about that. I will also send a note. There is just 1 or 2 logistics, and I want to dive into content right away. So the class, as most of you know, runs with this notion of a collaborative team. You all heard and saw just all kinds of people that we will never meet unless we extend our hand. And I think the same goes for everybody here. I hope you're excited about the fact that there is that breadth of diversity and a breadth of passion. Much of the team building happens on Discord. There is a link for Discord. try to really write a proper introduction, some citations for any work that you might have done in the past, because the team building will be quite organic. This is a do class, as I said, so the goal really is about diving into action. And the way I divide the content, especially for the first few weeks, is that we will always, every week, take one case study of a Frugal Science product that either we have been working on or others have been working on, and really tease it apart to really understand what happened from the idea phase all the way to a final implementation at scale. And then in the second lecture every week, we will dive into much more what you might call the fundamental science around Frugal Science, so that to make sure that many of you who are designers are not scared of many of the technical aspects of the work. And sometimes many of the technical folks haven't had the chance to understand and build upon the context of how do you apply that to problem solving. So there will always be this back and forth, and sometimes you will see in a case study, it will come together where you will realize that actually, you know, playing with mathematics, for example, can give you deep insights, which is the purpose of today's class. We're going to talk about numbers. And I think overall, the broad theme that the class covers in terms of projects and where there is a lot of expertise, both in this group and the mentors. Next week, I'll introduce the Mentors Network, which is really just a group of phenomenal people, including some that are here as well, that support ideas and projects. And the core really is around the context of, you know, health and health challenges, environmental and environmental monitoring, and education. So I think those are three key pillars that you'll hear over and over again. So with that as a start, and since we're already running out of time, I'm going to dive into what I wanted to cover today, with the hope and a suggestion that on Discord, I'll post the basic lecture, which I call just what is Frugal Science. I'm assuming you have kind of an intuition for it as a past. And I think eventually we can also run a session that's very dedicated. Last week, I dived into a little bit on malaria, and I think I'll also just post that lecture itself. So certain sets of things will be also online. So one thing that everybody should do is make sure you create a Discord account and do a quick introduction. So with that in mind, I want to dive into what I want to cover today. And I'm going to share my screen, and you all can tell me if you can see my screen. Can you all see my screen? And I'm assuming you all can see the screen, other than trying to figure out that as a criteria. If folks have questions, type them in chat. This is supposed to be interactive. And then the first thing I want to do is to actually see whether we can see the whiteboard, because we will be jumping back and forth from the whiteboard. Okay, so I think most of you saw certain sets of things. I think at some point of time, I might change and go to the whiteboard. So where we were last time in the class, we're really focused on, we talked about malaria. And we talked about malaria for the breadth of its complexity. We talked about the problem. We talked about the sense of kind of a humbling moment that you all have when you think about malaria as a problem at large. And all of that happens primarily because of what is the title of today's lecture, which is By the Numbers. And another way of thinking about this is just, what can you do with this object? And kind of, you know, I'm just describing a pencil. To many people, a pencil is a very powerful object, primarily because you can distill many of your ideas and conceptual frameworks, and sometimes even misconceptions, if you know how to dive into the numbers. And of course, there is an entire field now of big data, and you know, how does that apply to frugal challenges? How do you really appreciate and understand the scale of the challenge that you're working on? But also there is a part of this puzzle, which is a little bit of an art, which is associated with how do you get numbers for stuff that doesn't exist on the internet? And this has an old tradition, which is called the Fermi's problems. And so Fermi's problem is named after Enrico Fermi, who was a nuclear scientist and did an incredible amount of beautiful work in fundamental physics. And he's also the most famous for, all of you have probably heard this idea of the piano tuner problem, which is how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? And so I think we're going to dive into a little bit of that framework to say, how do you really go about addressing and answering questions in a sense when you have very little data to go by, and the sense of inference. So I think the pencil and paper is powerful. And as an exercise, we are going to do a homework on all the problems that you said you're all interested in. We will choose, you get to decide, but you will try to quantify that problem. And for some of you who haven't as yet picked a field, that's perfectly okay. You can quantify anything. You can, and we will talk about what is a good problem to pick up. And I think it's in some sense, it's an afternoon of work, but it is very valuable for what we are discussing today. It is important for you to do this exercise. You can't read about it. So I can tell you, I can walk you through how Enrico Fermi, just standing and watching a nuclear explosion, figured out on a pencil and paper what was the energy released in a nuclear bomb. And then that was a secret, and everybody was freaked out that how did the secret leak out? But it was just pencil and paper. You can read that explanation, or you can actually do it yourself, and it's two different things. And so I think this is an important distinction that we miss sometimes, that please do try to do that exercise by yourself. So, you know, I think one of the context of this is just very often enough said quite well in science. And sometimes when we are thinking about this, you know, from a planetary health perspective, for example, just the capacity to measure is very important. Some of you do work on measurement tools. And then not everything can be measured. And not everything has been measured as yet. So then you go back to the context of estimation. And, you know, I love kind of what Lord Kelvin said in that kind of a space is, I often say that when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. And it's, you know, it's not a punch on intuition. We often think and start with intuition, but the goal would be is for everything we work on, we are going to try to quantify it. Because, and again, you know, I think many a times in the context of design, you might have heard many a times people will solve a problem that doesn't exist. Or the other way around, that, you know, there is a massive problem and not enough people are working on it. And so when you're choosing problems, that becomes a very important tool to be able to classify this. So I'll start with the first example. I don't know how many of you remember or know the story of Jon Snow. It's very important in a COVID context, but this is the first example of data journalism. It's also the most famous map in the world. So I'm wondering if some of you recognize this map. Does anybody recognize this map? If you look carefully, you can read some of the roads. And also for anybody in the audience online, feel free to kind of post that in the chat. We will monitor the chats. I am curious if anybody recognizes this map.
Is this the plague?
It's the plague. So this is really the very first, the cholera map in London. And so Jon Snow was the very first epidemiologist in some sense. And one of the powerful techniques that he used, which was the hand pump, which was right in the heart of London. And again, it goes back to numbers and data. He did not know where the site of the problem was. But if you look right there, there is kind of a density of distribution of cases. So he went house by house. He collected this raw data. And from that emerged this single source, which you can see right in the middle, which happens to be the hand pump. And this hand pump was all he did to solve that cholera outbreak was he put a lock on that hand pump. So it's a very famous, iconic image in epidemiology, but really it's the start of data journalism. And effectively, sometimes data can drive hypothesis rather than what we are used to as scientists very often, where our hypothesis drives data generation. This is the other way around. It's data drives hypothesis. And often enough in now terminologies of dividing science, this is also called night science. You know, day science is when we do by the book, you come up with a hypothesis and you go collect data and see whether that matches or not. And night science is you just really look at data and then you say, where is it pointing? So, you know, you kind of have to remove yourself from the picture itself. This type of data exists everywhere. Anybody can use them. We're going to spend a little bit of time on kind of a sustainability context. A couple of really nice papers have come out in the last couple of years. So we'll spend a little time on a few examples of these and maybe try doing one or two on the board today. But I think if some of you have not, I'll leave this link here online. This is a beautiful historic recreation of what he actually did. The other example that is in the context of measurements, and maybe I'll just ask this question per se, because there's a lot of things that we believe in that we have not directly experienced. And so I'm going to pose that as a question to all of you and people here. Do atoms exist? You know, nobody here can claim that they have seen an atom. And so if that's the case, how would you go about answering this question? So, you know, anybody in the audience, if you want to write as a chat, what do people believe? Do atoms exist? And I know all of you believe atoms exist. It's a kind of, it's not a trick question, but I'm just wondering why you believe that. So what in your experience, what in measurements, and again, we will talk about the historical perspective of how society at large started believing in this idea. So I'm just curious, does anybody wants to shout out why we believe atoms exist? And, you know, you can be totally open, wild guesses. It's perfectly okay because you're just perturbing your intuition. Yeah.
It offers an explanation for a lot of the physical phenomena we see.
Yeah, so that's actually a very important insight. And what Selena just said is it offers an explanation for a significant portion of physical phenomena that we observe. And that's actually a very interesting way of thinking. And at that time, when the idea was introduced, it was starting to offer explanation for heat. It was starting to explain all of the ideal gas laws. And the counterattack on that, and it was a big counterattack because, you know, I don't know how many of you know, Boltzmann killed himself primarily because he was depressed. He proposed this idea. He knew mathematically it worked. It became this philosophical debate. Nobody believed him, and he killed himself. And the year he killed himself was when Einstein's paper came out that actually really convinced the world that it's here. The reason this philosophical debate happened was because people said, okay, it does explain, it offers explanation, so then it must be a mathematical tool. That is a very good mathematical tool because often enough, we can use mathematics to explain many sets of ideas, which we call models. But does that mean that our models are actually true? And this is a very subtle point. And when you're thinking about numbers, it is true that in the model and the numbers that you will use, there might be intricacies of that which will get hidden. And that is the whole point. We do want to hide the intricacies in some sense. But it is valuable to think about that this was the argument that was given back that, okay, you know, it offers a very good model. And I actually read this here. It's quite a famous saying, is in terms of, there were those who did not toe the positivist line, and it's referring to there were the atomist and there was the non-atomist. I don't know, there was a name for that. In Paris, Adolphe Wirth argued passionately that atoms and molecules were really there to be observed in the lab as physical objects. Then there were the Maxwells and the Boltzmann, whose work on kinetic theory of gases implied the presence of particles of just nanometers in size. So they could actually predict a size at that time. There was a sense that this is what it might be. And the champions of the atomic theory, Lord Kelvin and Rayleigh, flourished in England, but as long as no one could actually see an atom, skeptics like Dunham, Oswald, were able to maintain that such entities were only models dear to physicists of the English school. And, this is referring to Maxwell and other folks who first started this. And it took a long while, but very suddenly something quite remarkable happened, which is the Einstein's paper on Brownian motion. And in that paper, and I think if anybody who's interested in thinking about this, Einstein is most famous for some of his work in relativity. His Nobel Prize is actually on how light interacts with matter, but he has a very profound contribution at that time. And he came up with 5 independent methods to measure the size of the atom, purely using this empirical framework that we're talking about. Take observations you begin with, apply the principles and physics that you know so far, and derive the size of an atom from that. And he didn't do that just by one method, he did that by 5 methods. And that's really where, when you kind of think about the establishment of a size of an atom, and then he showed that completely independent methods give rise to the same number that have nothing in common between them. And then Jean Perrin saw that paper. It was still a theoretical calculation. And then Jean Perrin actually did the experiments, which is this famous Brownian motion experiment. And the reason I like this in terms of thinking about, for some of you who you love numbers, purely using a foldscope, which some of you have, and some of you will get introduced to and will have, you can actually calculate the size of the atom by yourself. So, in this is, again, certain sets of observations have to be made, which is that particles jiggle and wiggle in a solution. And if you have not seen that before, we'll spend some time when we do the full scope demos. We will spend time measuring the size of the atom. But what becomes very important in that framework is that making sure that you actually follow through that calculation. And that calculation is intense in terms of there's a lot of new ideas that he had to introduce and think about. But the key is, and when you're trying to estimate, try to estimate something by multiple methods that use not the same data source. That's the key. Because then even if you made a mistake, and then of course you can get totally different estimates. And this is how people measure the rough variation in a given estimate, is you take 2 approaches and they don't match, which they don't have to. And then you can say, this is the range that I'm interested in. And I think we'll try doing this now for a couple of examples, so folks have an intuition for how to actually do this in real life. Okay, so, and I think, I'm just harping on my love for mathematics and how we use mathematics in a lot of frugal science kind of a context. I think this is a quote from Charles Darwin that doesn't get stated that much, but he said, in after years, I have deeply regretted that I did not proceed far enough, at least to understand something of the great leading principles of mathematics. For men and women thus endowed seem to have an extra sense. And it's very perceptive of him to really reflect on this, to say what I was missing in his training. And it is true. The field of ecology and the field of speciation cannot be explained without mathematical principles. The theory of evolution has a very strong mathematical basis at this point. And he wished he had those sets of things. He would have actually been able to do a lot more and infer a lot more, even as an ecologist. He appreciated and spent a lot of time in ecosystems, but he was lacking the kinds of tools to turn that into numbers. And actually, unfortunately, the point of the discussion for today's class is the fact that in ecology still remains a very, data scarce field from the scale of the problem. And we'll kind of talk about it. Just, can you estimate how many insects are there on this planet? That actually is a very difficult problem to sort of understand. I'm gonna admit Julius. And then Ellie, if you see somebody, then you can just admit them. Julius, welcome to the class. We already started some time ago. Maybe at the end of the class, I do want you to introduce yourself to everybody. So we'll kind of do that in the end. Okay, so I think what I want to do today, and I think feel free if people have questions and other threads, feel free to raise hands and other sets of things. It is important to get certain kind of a feedback associated. This is really a conversation. And again, for anybody, I want to turn this into a conversation, but I want to first give you a class of resources that are associated with this. And then the first resource, and really the people that inspired me in thinking about this quite deeply for a long while, and people who have been focused on this type of an approach for cell biology first, are these two folks here. This is Ron Milo and Rob Phillips. Rob is at Caltech, Ron is at Weizmann. And they started long time ago when Ron was just starting his work in systems biology, a resource called Cell Biology by the Numbers. And so you can see Ron holding that book. You can download that book. The book is available online. For some of you who are very interested in biological principles and especially using biology and synthetic biology kind of approaches, it really is a Bible. Because what you can do is, and then we will just do that as an exercise. I'm just going to type here, okay, Cell Biology by the Numbers, and there is an associated website called BioNumbers. And I'm hoping, so I arrive at the site and I'm assuming you all can see that. And it says I am looking for, so I'm curious, anybody in the crowd, any biological question that you have been wondering about, let's type that and see what happens. So anybody wants to in chat, write any biological number that you've been curious about? Anybody here? We'll just play with this for a little. What might you want to know? Anything. We'll do this for a broader fields as well, but I think this is a little bit of a resource very specific to cell biology. You know, I could ask, okay, how many, this is a pretty standard thing, is how many protein, what is a mass of a cell, right? So I want to know a mass of a cell on average, so I can type in mass of a cell. And, you know, it comes in, it talks about, I can find the mass of an E. coli, I can find, and then it also is sharing all kinds of other related numbers associated with it. So I'm going to type here, say, number of proteins in a cell. And you can say it's going to think for a little bit. And okay, let me remove that.
The number of chat.
Okay, so I'm going to just check in some sense. And one of the other things about this is, so it's an interactive resource that all of you can use in some sense. And I'm just going to check in terms of chat. I want to confirm. There are two interfaces to it. There is one, this is really much more biology by numbers. I want to make sure I'm on the right link. Yeah, so this is much more of a, it gives you the direct access, and there is a more refined form which refers to which page in the book. I like this one more, so we're just going to write something, say, number of proteins in a cell. And I think, you know, suddenly now you kind of have this total number of amino acids in a cell, and it references the citation. So when you're doing your homework, it's actually very important if you did find something, because your estimate is only as good as what your reference is. And so I think, you know, this is the site that I would want to use. We can post this on chat, and I'm going to just look the number of mitochondria in a neuron. And so let's search that. Number of mitochondria And I'll type mitochondria, and then I can find abundance. And one of the things to try to do is play with this as a resource because it will give you a sense of where to start. This is just really a database. We're not there at the estimation as yet, but it is important to see. And I think some of these numbers, if you go back and then read that paper, you might actually find that, oh, that was also an estimate to begin with. This is a phenomenal resource. And I think there is another resource that I'm about to talk about that's even more exciting than this that both Ron and Rob have recently released. But one of the things to think a little bit about here is we're not going to spend too much time now on that framework. But for example, having an intuition for length scales, and this is on the small length scales, and we will talk about the large length scales, is incredibly important when you are building and designing projects. When you have an intuition for being able to use this type of a framework to then go to higher length scales or smaller length scales that you might care about. So for example, as we discussed in the past, and I think for some of the threads, we are going to be, so just for folks online, last class, we spent a lot of time just talking about malaria as a problem. And so then if some of you then are choosing a problem for your homework, you might say, I want to estimate how many parasites are floating in a human body when the person is sick, right? Or you might ask that, okay, I did a diagnostic test for a person and I saw 50 copies of parasite per microliter in their capillary blood. Now, what does that mean in terms of the total percentage of red blood cells that are actually infected? Because when a red blood cell is infected, the blood cell cannot carry hemoglobin because the hemoglobin is being consumed, and so the oxygen levels go down. And exactly when replication happens in a malaria parasite is when you get the chills and fevers. So you know that your clinical symptoms are actually directly related to this replication cycle. But if you want to better estimate in terms of thinking about, in terms of exploiting this principle of by the numbers to apply that to a framework of malaria, you would want to start estimating. And then, of course, we will talk about mosquitoes quite a lot in another class. You might say, okay, I want to estimate the number of mosquitoes in my neighborhood. And now that's a little bit more open problem. You can see that that's a hard one because environment matters. One place you can find no mosquitoes, another place you can find lots of mosquitoes. So you have to think a little bit about a much more complex, nuanced estimation type of an approach. So let's try doing a few of these estimations for a second, and then we'll come back to this. But again, do keep in mind the biology by the numbers as a very important framework. Another one that's, COVID is on everybody's minds at all times. This is a fantastic resource also in context of just COVID itself. This is COVID by the numbers, but it goes through literally, how many number of base pairs are there? How many mutations can actually happen as a function of time? What is the universe of mutations? Every one of these things can then be quantified. And you will find that any time that you're actually working on a problem like this, you can go back to either reference it or choose it. For example, something that we worked on, and maybe Prabha can talk about this as well. With COVID, the hard part was what should be the sensitivity of your test? A molecular test, you might want to measure, one copy of the RNA I want to detect in any of my sample, the smallest amount of RNA. But then it turns out people do have actually very small amount of RNA in their samples all the time, even for months and months and months. And this is why they tell you that you should not, if you have been PCR positive, you're going to be PCR positive for a while. And so when you are even building a technology that's very health oriented, you need to understand what should be your appropriate cutoff. Because cost will matter. If you want to make the highest sensitivity assay, it might be costly. So for a public health perspective, what should be the cutoff point that you should build and design your assay for? It's a non-trivial estimation, and you have to do this in a population context to say, what am I trying to do? Here are the sets of numbers. This is what has been measured in the past. What is my estimate if I'm trying to catch 95% of all cases such that transmission is reduced by this amount? What should be the sensitivity specificity of my test by design? And then you can choose an appropriate technology that might map and mirror something like that. So I think I'm just giving you more and more examples of thinking about where and why numbers are useful. And, you know, I think one of the phenomena of this is you can then go back and think about this from a context of the patient itself. There is a huge amount of mystery still in the context of what truly happens in a patient in a COVID context. If any of you chooses COVID as an example, you will have tons of data to work with because it's the most data-centered disease that we have actually tried to handle. Okay, so I think let's do some exercises now. We're going to transition, as I said, into doing. And so one of the frameworks that I'm excited about is, you know, in some sense, let's think a little bit about numbers that surprise you or things that you might have thought about that you'd feel you have an intuition for, but you have never quantified it. So we are creating our own homework assignment. Anybody in the chat can type in what types of estimates might you want to do for your projects, for example. And then we're going to do one very specific estimate related to the ocean and sustainability. But before that, and things that people pointed out, you can also raise your hand and then talk at this time. But I'm curious for the things that you might have thought about. Like, I think you have a very data-centered puzzle in some sense. And so I'm curious if there was one number that you wanted to get to, what that might be. Yeah.
It's not something I'll think about it.
Yeah. No. I think it's not about what that specific thing is, but it's about sharing an intuition. Where do you might feel that there is this gap? Like, I think cost is something that you brought up. I think a lot has been written about the dollar amounts we spend per person in the United States, for example. And this is something that, of course, might just exist as a data set. But then you can extend that. The idea is to just think out loud in some sense. What might be out there that you have a feeling for that might be useful, but you don't know as yet how to get there. And so I'm just trying to generate enough sets of threads on things that are relevant to what you're all passionate about. Anybody else wants to shout out of, I think you said something about data centers, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
I guess kind of the thinking is more like for specific, like there's specific data sets that just like aren't created because like capturing data is hard. But like, you know, if you could throw a camera on some device that can be like, people can spin up, you know, all around the world to generate diverse data sets, then that can be a good way to create new ones. I don't know if there's
but I had thought that you meant, maybe I misunderstood the question. I thought you had meant sustainability in data centers.
Sure.
Is that what you meant?
I mean, that's also like an interesting question.
Yeah. Because I actually read this today morning as a newspaper article early morning. That, I mean, it's an interesting one. I find it puzzling. I want to do this calculation myself. But the hint was, I mean, we're all excited about cars of the future. And the idea was that if there are 1 billion cars that have automated driving, they will be consuming, even if they drive for only 1 hour, they will be consuming much of the energy estimates that are associated with all of our computing on the planet in terms of energy. And then hence, if you count energy, then you have to think about emissions. And so in some sense, as we make cars more and more compute heavy, they have a different kind of an emission, which is more complex to think about. And I found that quite profound, just as a number to put out there. 1 billion cars, you know, that's a little bit of an overestimate, but 1 hour is a complete underestimate. And the number that popped out was that they would use as much or more power as every data center on the planet. And so then suddenly it makes you realize, like, wait a second, I mean, we are, of course, moving towards that future and electrification is good, but have we accounted for the compute cost, which is something that you leave for granted? I mean, you know, I don't ever think about the computers are so efficient in terms of a light bulb versus a computer. You all know light bulbs cost far more energy. But in some sense, when you make it so intensive that every fraction of a second a decision is being made, and you know, that by itself is a paper, it's a story, it's an important way to influence people to think about their problems more carefully. So I think this is why I'm saying this is actually quite a thoughtful exercise that people should do early on in areas that you're interested in, because you will find that surprising. I mean, in the lab, we think quite a lot about carbon sequestration in the ocean. I know Tapan and a few other entrepreneurs on the call mention carbon sequestration in the ocean. I'm curious, anybody else on the online community wants to volunteer and a puzzle? Oh, okay, I'm opening the chat now. Tafia has a good one, and I know where this comes from because we went diving in Indonesia and we saw manta rays sucking up plastic. It was the most depressing marine image I have ingrained in my head. The number of microplastics released to the ocean per hour. And I mean, it's a beautiful one because it has the complexity. You're not just saying the total microplastics, you want to understand and know the rate of flux, because it might be that that rate of flux is actually increasing rather than decreasing. And it also has to do with something to be able to estimate, because microplastics, although later on gets homogenized, majority of the time, if they are non-uniformly distributed, your solution might be much more focused on, say, Lagos, several rivers in India, several rivers here, so that where the efflux goes into the ocean is where you want to capture it. So it's actually important to also understand that. And so I think Tafia has just created a homework problem for herself, but of course, anybody can dive in and take on that set of a challenge. I'm seeing another one. The value by which our microbial biodiversity is decreasing on the planet. And I mean, this is a phenomenal one as well, because in the later on versions of the classes, we will talk quite a lot about the sixth extinction. So some of you might have heard that the rate of extinction currently is matching some of our older extinctions. But what's missing in all of those estimates is the microbial extinction, because we don't even know what we have, and we are losing species faster than we can find them. And the microbial estimates for that are actually incredibly important. And literally, I mean, I think the thing that I am getting excited about just reading these, many of these things that you are all writing on chat are literally stories that people may or may not have even asked. And especially because we get so data-centered about what we can do, sometimes we forget where we want to go. And so, you know, there is a sense of this that it's okay that you cannot measure everything, but there are ways in estimating certain sets of scenarios. So I'm going to read a few more because these are really interesting. Percentage of Staphylococcus aureus in an adult nose. I like that a lot. Let's see, the percentage of pollen in the space of a flowering garden. I can see, Julius, and from a context of asthma, that's a beautiful one, because suddenly for people that have asthma, this is a huge issue and they call it to season. So how many flowers can you safely plant in your garden? Another one related to this that I've always thought about, which was related to a full scope project that somebody in the full scope DC club did, which is how long or what distance on average does a pollen travel? Because they were seeing pollen species of flowers that don't exist in the DC area. And we have always just assumed this idea that, oh, pollens are local. And then this person actually had asthma and his family was fairly sensitive. And so he wanted to know which ones are around. And it turned out that it was coming from long distance. And again, it's a very different measurement to make. You can't tag a pollen, but you can estimate these sets of things. I'm going to read a few more. Arjun asks the amount of plastic materials that's been dumped into the ocean after it's been used for packaging. So actually, I mean, this is another interesting thing that you can connect that to packaging. You could ask the percentage of that that comes from straws. Many of you saw the campaigns around straws. And there was a counter campaign that straws form a very small portion of that. But how would you really estimate rigorously by yourself? whether that is true or not, because it's one campaign versus the other. Number of pollutant particles emitted by a car for a given distance. I like this a lot, especially it's kind of in the context of how much you drive. David mentioned, what is the percentage of US federal science budget spent on tools, materials, and equipment? That is a fantastic one, especially in the context of, science. When we do science, it's said, oh, you support people or you support tools, but it's not so obvious. And again, I think one of the fun things that might be with that calculation is that maybe that equipment distribution is completely inequitable. You might see that lots of expensive instruments go in centralized places, while very little budget is there for much more of a mass distribution of certain sets of instruments and hence capabilities. So you're all just making up your own homework. Thank you very much for that. So I don't have to think about it, but I'm quite serious about it. I think if you're serious about this class, this is one example. Really take the ownership. You're going to be taking the ownership for your projects. And I think, I can influence and twist people's arms, and, there's no sense of grading here. There's no sense of, you're not being evaluated. I'm not going to be checking whether you did this or not, but genuinely, if you're serious about this, take on a challenge and spend a week doodling. We will talk about the techniques. I can give you a lot of tools, and on Discord, some other people can jump on, do that collaboratively, try to estimate an answer and post that on Discord. We will now create a channel. I think I did last night, which is called By the Numbers. Post your solution there to say, hey, this is what I came up with. Can somebody find a hole? Or post that to say, oh, the thing that I cannot figure out is this. And that can be somebody else's homework. And literally the content that you generate is novel content, because in the end, you are driving this question. So I'm really hoping, I think, Ellie, can you capture just a snapshot of the chat so that we can post some of these? But then again, your names are associated on Discord. Please, please, please write these down. And we're going to try to take a few of them in a much more detail when we review them. But again, I think there's a lot of resources on this, but unless you choose to do it explicitly, I think you will miss out on the techniques. So let me jump into a few sets of techniques that are used. And, I think we will talk quite a lot about data visualization in a second, but that's much more about when you have the numbers, then how do you influence opinions, where you are then able to visualize it in a way that an average person that sometimes is not, one estimate that you can do literally right now is the total dry mass of humans on the planet. And it'll turn out, somewhere, I was doing this last night, maybe 0.1 gigaton or something like that. And somebody might say, oh, what is gigaton? I don't know. And but data visualization is another thing. And we will do that as another exercise. When you have that type of data, you have to visualize it. And especially for socially inclined problems, when you're trying to engage communities and societies and recruit many talented people in this room for your own project, it is how compelling a story you can tell. And so I think I'll come back to data visualization in a second. But I want to talk about this paper. It's one of my favorite papers in kind of the COVID context of when the COVID threads were happening. And the question, this is from Ron Milo's lab itself. And then now they've released another resource, which I think is incredibly valuable. It's called Anthropocene by the Numbers. And we'll go to the website very soon, which is now the idea of what does it mean for humans to make an impact? So I think the big question that they asked, and I know the story, this is not how they asked it, but now later on they learned this. This is a great way of telling that story. Classically, Ron describes this as, we have been comparing apples to oranges. And that's a common joke, you can't compare apples and oranges or something. He said, that's the wrong question. We should be comparing apples to iPhones. And what he means by that is, what is the total biomass of human-made material on this planet? And how does it compare to the biomass of the living world? And if you're thinking about, of course, we are making impact, but some people are like, oh, we're not sure, the climate and all that. Here is a very explicit way of posing that number. If you were to think about the anthropogenic mass on the planet, and you were to think about the living biomass, what would be different between the two? Is there a crossover point? When in the future will we ever produce more just crap, whatever humans live by? I mean, I know it's essential, we survive by it, but a lot of it is also crap. When does that crossover happen? And I'm actually curious, before we dive in, anybody wants to say, when do you think this crossover will happen? Like, you know, without doing the numbers, I feel if you have an intuition for it. Anybody can also write that on the chat. When might we cross over? There's a lot of stuff around, but the planet is big and we have vast, you know, forests, and, you know, forests are heavy. So this is dry mass, by the way. So
1 century.
1 century from now. So 100 years from now, we might cross it. Okay. Anybody else?
Maybe already.
Maybe already. That's a sober thought. Anybody on the chat? So I don't know how to open. Okay. Okay, I think somebody else also said it's already crossed. There is a lot of garbage dumps. And actually, that is the correct answer. So the unfortunate reality is that was 2020. It was exactly the moment when the crossover happened. So if you now go back and read this paper, it's called The Global Human-Made Mass Exceeds All Living Biomass 2020. The paper comes out in 2020 and the crossover point also falls in 2020. And I think we're going to dive in a little bit of the methodology of what they use to be able to arrive at this estimate. There are lots of important estimates, but it's a very rigorous paper. And again, you know, the rigor is what makes you believe, but it's an important realization just for us as a whole when we think about that the amount of material that we have made has crossed over. And what does that mean as, you know, the technology curve is still kicking up and we always believe in technological solutions to it? What does that mean from a context of mass on the planet? So, you know, I think the way that they frame this is, and again, as a reading assignment, it would be fantastic if people spent some time reading this paper. There is maybe roughly around 30, 40 pages of supplementary materials. You can skim through some of that, but I think the idea is for you to see the methodology, and I'll describe the methodology on the board for a second. But just very briefly speaking, what they try to do is essentially estimate the living biomass. So let's do that very quickly. If people have pencil and papers on their hands, let's do a quick calculation of how much biomass, dry biomass there is for humans. Humans, we know how many humans there are, 10 to the 8, right? No, 10 to the 9, right? 10 to the 9, yes, not, right?
Close to 10%.
Actually, close to 10 to the 10. I'm sorry, I'm totally outdating myself here. Yes. So there's roughly around 10 billion humans. We can estimate some kind of a rough estimate for the weight of a human, average weight. So not just including adults, but also children. So, you know, the way you do these numbers is you want to write round numbers. So 100 would be a little overestimate. So 50 is a good number. You know, 25, I feel, would be a complete underestimate. It'll only be for children. And so then when you multiply those two numbers, you really get some of the mass, but then it has a lot of water. You've all heard humans are 70% water. 70% is a good average number to think about. So you reduce that by 70% and you will arrive at the biomass of a human, right? And again, you know, I think when you kind of do this type of a number, my intuition is it's roughly around 0.1 gigaton or something. And this is, you know, it gives you a sense for humans, you can do this very cleanly. You can figure out what is the total mass of humanity. But then if I was to ask, how do I know that for plants? Or how do I know that for all of the insects on the planet? And that's a little difficult to think about because there are so many species. We don't have a sense of thinking about how their mass varies. And this is where the estimates come into play in going back into the record and kind of, I'll just describe the methodology that they used. For example, the ocean, and we deeply care about the ocean for a lot of projects in this class. So if I want to know how much total biomass is there in the ocean, one challenge is there's no direct way of measuring the ocean. Is quite big. But the trick that you can use is that some parts of the ocean, especially the Atlantic, for example, have been measured incredibly well. There's lots of expeditions that go out. They publish sets of data sets of number of species, abundance of species, at least in the euphotic zone, the light zone. You can think a little bit in terms of the Mediterranean is actually also quite well quantified because of past expeditions. And then the next thing that comes about in that framework would be what about the places that we have never measured? And I think the technique that they developed in this particular paper is this idea that you look for ecological trends. So you say for this temperature range and this region, if I can find one sample that is well documented, I'm going to correlate this environmental parameter to this biomass. And so the big assumption that they are making is that if environmental conditions are similar, somewhat that ecosystem has a similar, and I think, when you think about different rainforests around the world, they are slightly different, but if they fall into this trap, it's a good way of estimating some amount of biomass. And then they go back and do this for the Arctic. Some portions of the Arctic have been very well measured, and you apply that to much of the region of the Arctic just because the weather conditions might be similar. And so with that as a framework, you can broaden, and that's what takes the work. There is a sense of estimation, and a lot of people have contributed in terms of the trends that exist. And it takes a little bit to kind of convince yourself. You can apply multiple techniques to it to get to the right answer. And so they did this, and I think the results is what I want to really talk about. Here is one example. So it turns out in the total biomass, and I think, I don't know if I should have asked you all to guess, look at how large plants are. So if you're thinking of solutions, plants should be in your thought process. And ironically, all of this is actually quite terrestrial. The total number of biomass in the ocean compared to the biomass on the terrestrial, there is a huge difference between the two. And you can just try to compare that kind of in a context of a distribution. And we have known this, the ocean are dilute. It doesn't mean that they don't play a very heavy hand, because the processes that are at play can be very important and very complex. So it is true, actually, from a carbon sequestration point of view, if you do the numbers, the oceans will come out. But it's just, we have always felt if you dive into the ocean, the density of life, and this is including bacteria, and it's also including viruses, which is kind of fun because you can compare the viral biomass. The other aspect of this is, you can look at the animal biomass there. And what I love about this plot, which is right here, let's focus on that. That's the human biomass right here. And we are only 0.01% of the total biomass. And compare that to the livestock that we eat. That's actually 4% of all animal biomass. And it's significantly, you can see it starts to compare with our human biomass itself. And as compared to that, now look at the livestock and wild mammals. And you can see the total wild mammals, even the total biomass everywhere around. Livestock took over a long time ago. And a friend of mine told me this story a long time ago, that if you are a paleontologist, and many centuries later, which unfortunately the trends we're on, maybe no humans exist at that time, and some other alien species come to the planet right now and start digging for bones and evidence of who lived here, who do you think they will find? And his answers was the alien is going to think that this planet was ruled by chickens. Because if you look at the biomass of billions of chicken bones that are going to be in, and for the future generation, chicken is going to be the fossil fuel. It's the dinosaurs still. And it's ironic, but if you do the numbers, it really is true. that the mass of chicken bones that on this planet that we leave behind is really actually far supersedes many of these other kind of mammalian bones that you can find and other sets of things you can find. So just by the numbers, they will think that chickens were really the rulers. And I think one of the things to do about this is sometimes it's also just valuable to dive into this data. So now this data has been transformed into, there's a website that we use, it's called Our World in Data. Really fun way of exploring kinds of questions and other threads. But again, we are going to spend time in our reading to actually really walk through this paper carefully. And if I go in now, for example, I want to show you what this paper ended up becoming, just like the BioNumbers website. I'm going to type enthronumbers.org. And so now here is this database. Now we can have a lot of fun. So it's called the Human Impact Database. And let's type, what do you want to type? I could type number of pigs breathing right now. Number of pigs alive. Okay, alive is maybe number of pigs. I was hoping the Chat GPT type of a pigs. Okay, standing population of pigs is 10 to the power 9. And, you know, that gives you a sense. That's a lot of pigs. I could do that for something like, okay, how much feedstock? What is the efficiency associated with pork? And then many of you, when you make decisions about your own choices for food, could go back and look through. And so I could say number of trees. Okay. So global net forest area change. I know that this should be able to, I should be able to find plants. Let's just check. And you're starting to see associated with any search that you do, there are certain sets of threads that come about, right? And so now I can write here iPhones. I'm curious whether they have that electronics. Huh. I think I know that some of the materials database is also implemented in something like this, because I think there is a comparison between the human living side of the story, but also kind of what we make and create. And so I think, yeah.
It says on the website, it's a collection of 307 useful numbers. It doesn't sound like a lot. So I was wondering.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I'm a little bit confused by that, is that in the sense, maybe the thread is that then from that are the estimates that are built in, that 307 are the baseline, but then they do actually estimate threads on it. So you can generate numbers from other numbers to begin with.
Estimate them instantaneously, like as you search it.
I don't think from a compute point of view, this has no machine learning. This is not the compute source. It's just a reference to the paper essentially. So for example, like, you know, this is the supplementary material for that paper. And we can spend some time on that, where there are 300 or so raw numbers that it starts with. But then effectively, for the questions that we are talking about, there are lots of things that estimate, but none of that is in the compute engine. So you should think of that much more as a reference library. And again, this is not a true reference library. I'll mention a few reference libraries like the World in Data, the WHO. All they did is essentially collected things together, but it was an important way of collecting things together, because then it was relevant questions we can ask. Because when we have just ledgers and ledgers of numbers, and you can't pinpoint of how it makes an impact, then suddenly it becomes hard. And I think to a certain extent, we get lost in data as well in the health kind of a context itself. So I think one of the homework exercises will be, for people that are interested, is spend some time, you know, if you don't want to read the paper, you can just try reading through this kind of a graphics. And I think you're right that in the very end, they are talking about there is a code associated with it. So water withdrawal has a certain, sea level rise has certain, these are basically the raw numbers that's starting. And of course, it's very important that any calculation that you do find a source. It can be a secondary source. So my source can be is like, oh, you estimated that, but then that's a source. Then we can go back to that and you can follow that through. But make sure when you're finding these numbers that you do find a source associated with it. How are we doing on time? What time do we usually stop? Okay, so I think, by the way, I booked the class till 10:20, much more because I wanted to make sure that we have breathing room for discussions. I'm going to try to keep this around 1.5 hours is a long enough time. So roughly we'll stop on average around 10. So I have maybe 2 more minutes. So maybe let's just, and then for folks that will stay, we'll have a little bit of a conversation just with the online folks in terms of logistics associated with this. So, maybe the oceans, let me pick that up because I was going to now dive into the ocean context associated with it. So as a closure, let me just show you this plot. So I think this is their estimated plot. And, I think 2020 plus minus 6. And it's so, it's kind of now. And in some sense, you can see there is this context of a biomass, and then there is this increasing context of the anthropogenic mass. And what is valuable is, I think this is another good representation of thinking about it. So if you just purely look at animals, plastics by weight are higher than all animals. And that's another wake-up call in terms of just thinking about, for many of you thinking about projects, we have generated more plastic than all animal biomass, the living animal biomass. And then when you think about trees and plants being a big portion, as we had said right here, so here you can kind of compare and you see plants take over. Animals are a much, much smaller footprint. But then the other comparing number in that is just the buildings and the infrastructure, the roads and other things that we create have far superseded. And again, that is an experience. Like you drive around, you see less plants, you see more buildings. And so at some point of time, that crossover had to happen. And I think the purpose of this entire framework and this exercise and just this particular class is, remember that the one thing I want you to take away from today's class is that this is a very powerful object. The thing that I described is not a very heavy, there is no machine learning, there is no giant number crunching. It's very, very simple calculations like arithmetic, which we all learn. But frankly, what is honest about it is just asking the right questions. And so in my mind, the first lesson in frugal science is you just ask the right question and you ask honest questions. And you really, before you think about solutions, dive into the depth of the problem that you care about, and really never forget this object. It's always there. You can always write a quick calculation, no matter what. It will give you an helpful way of thinking. And we are not after the final number. That's not the point. The point is an approach, because there might be hidden variables that you didn't think about. There might be ways of thinking that you didn't think about. And I think this is kind of why I'm saying, although we glorified in some sense, it was a Nature paper and it was a big deal and a lot of people talked about it. That comes much later when they had the confidence. The much more important thing I like to take away from it is how many other calculations like this are out there that allow us to at least have a self-reflection. And some of those could literally be for yourself, just, oh, how much water do I use in showers every day or on average? And it's a very personal thing, but it's valuable because it's not about something that you want to project outside, but internally in the decisions that we make. In the sense of global health, if you're really thinking about pathogens and other threads, one of the threads is that it will help you there's a classic world in global health called the neglected disease problem, which are diseases that have a huge burden on human population, but the budget that's given to it, TB is a classic example, but TB doesn't classify as a neglected, but still the outproportionate impact versus the budget is very small. Schistosomiasis, you can go find. This was one example for why snake bites were finally put on the list of neglected diseases. because literally thousands and thousands of people were dying, and we just have not moved the needle in snakebite research as much. The sets of solutions that exist in snake bites is just abysmal in terms of, and then the harm it causes is quite large. And until you do the numbers, so any one of you who's interested in snake bites, try estimating the total number of snake bites in India, or even your Tamil Nadu, for example, and you'll kind of get a sense of the scale of the problem associated with human kind of an impact. So before we log off, I think if folks that are online want to stay a little bit longer, I can just catch up on some of the logistics, and especially the Discord and the project. And if anybody has any questions about how this course is going to be running, I wanted to spend much more time actually doing stuff, so we didn't put that much time on that logistics. We're going to say otherwise goodbye to both the folks that want to disconnect and folks here. There are two homeworks associated with this. One is play with that paper. All the Jupyter notebooks for that paper are online, so you can actually run some of the calculations. Some of you who are compute intensive and enjoy playing with numbers, all of those estimates are online. They're collaboratory, which are these Jupyter notebooks, are online. And then the other part of that would be is if any of you is interested, oh no, this is a homework. Find one question that you want to estimate. And then again, you can also Google and find many different resources. I think there is no problem, I feel, that you can't apply this approach to. So with that, we're going to say good night for some of you, or good morning for some of you. Our day is just starting, so we are going to pick this up on Thursday. And then the lab session on Friday, we will finish building certain sets of threads. And then I think probably not this week, but next week, I will talk a little bit about the logistics of projects and other threads, because the idea is to have a mixed sets of teams. And so now we can just turn in on just the online folks that are here. If anybody has any questions on the logistics, and I know some of you were able to join late. I only sent the message last night, pretty late night, after having read all the applications. So I apologize for that. We will catch up. This is recorded, so we will post some of this too. I'm going to stop the recording now.